Hello, how are you? So this is called The Return of the Carvajal. It's a mystery. And the first thing that catches my eye is this quote. Books are not made to be believed, but be subjugated to inquiry. So when we consider a book, we mustn't ask ourselves what it says, but what it means. And that is by Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. So part one discusses whoever destroys a soul, it is considered as if he destroyed an entire person. That is Talmud Yerushalmi. So The Thief, Penn State University, a very small and odd-looking book that draws one in. It starts out with books that are not meant to be believed, but subject to inquiry. When one considers a book, a person must ask themselves not what it says, but what it means. It starts off with the first chapter called The Thief. What does the thief mean? What is it trying to tell the reader? It speaks about the sudden reemergence of a misplaced item is often the stroke of luck. This is because nothing is what it appears, but that it is hidden from sight. It goes on to explain that the Carvajal booklet, the Mexican libraries are not careful with their archives, and this is a big problem. The Mexican government is not known for its efficiency, and this is what the author is trying to explain when he's dealing with, trying to express how the Carvajal felt. In 1930, when the Carvajal booklet, 9 by 3 inches, that's how little the book was. The police were not worried about this. Around the same time as Mexico's revolution, which coincided with the First World War. So one learns from the book that there was a revolution in Mexico, but before this, which most don't know, is Mexico was called New Spain. And the Inquisition, like in Spain, was here, a 180-page manuscript by a crypto Jew targeted by the Inquisition. The author was known as Luis de Carvajal the Younger. His uncle was the governor at the time with the same name, which is really cool, I thought. But he's called the Elder. So the Carvajal came from Spain and became openly Jewish and viewed as the Messiah. It seems strange to me that he views himself to be the Messiah. Here I was wondering, what kind of a Messiah was he referring to himself? Was he thinking that he is the Messiah? Or is he a leader and a helper trying to save his people from the terrible Inquisition? If one was Jewish, then he was expelled from the country. And if one converted to Christianity, then he was considered a new Christian. And in fear of all the time of being caught, it also becomes, are you good enough? Are you Christian enough? I feel this has had a huge impact on society and a huge impact on why Jews don't speak out most of the time. For thousands of years, the question is, are you a good citizen? It's shameful to be a Jew. By having all these inquisitions, it becomes to be Jewish a shameful thing to be. Peer pressure, ostracized, nowhere to go. One has no choice but to hide their religion, because otherwise they will be burned at the stake. Is he this Meshuggah? Perhaps that is why the reader does not get to see the actual manuscript, the fact that he believes that maybe he's the Messiah. What makes this manuscript so interesting? It was a real account of what was happening during this period. The auto de fe, the burning at the stake, was like going to the movies. If you could only imagine how terrible that was, but at that time, that's what it was. And the prisoner was tortured on the rack in the most painful ways to confess to being a Jew, a terrible crime in Inquisition times. The prisoner would confess to more Jews being Jews, and the victims are paraded in front of a large audience. The Carvajal was put on the rack and denounced by his relatives and friends. But this was common because if one didn't denounce him, most likely they would be put to death as well. The impact this had on the prisoner was also terrible. In one's worst time of pain, to have no one to be there for him. The manuscript was his last will and testament. It has prayers in the back of it, which is, I think, pretty cool, pretty interesting, especially for those times. A person is a crypto Jew. Carvajal acknowledges that even if he was tortured, he wanted to be a martyr. He justified it, thinking that this is a Jewish person's fate to be a martyr. This is also the first time in the Americas, Spanish America, there was the Inquisition, and not freedom as was portrayed. As you always think, America, everyone's like, freedom, it's home of the brave, and the land of the free. But obviously here it was not the case. Here it was a very serious thing. If you were Jewish, you were put to death. The Inquisition in Mexico was established in around 1520. The argument being that if one wanted opportunity, they had to prove themselves, even as a new Christian, was not enough. Carvajal acknowledged others to return to their roots and be a full-fledged Jew. The strange thing about the manuscript is that it is written in the third person, when it is being written about himself. Carvajal felt that his ancestors, including him, were forced to renounce their Judaism. But when he gave himself a circumcision, he felt that he was being part of the Jewish tribe again. Here he was bringing people back, but at the same time, he also had anti-Semitism bent to him as well, which I feel is so interesting, because you can't escape the times as much as you're trying to be, who you really are, which in this case, he was Jewish and he wanted to be a practicing Jew. He didn't even realize that he still had an anti-Semitic bent, because for how many, hundreds of years, even thousands of years, this is how society was. His father, whose name he dropped, encourages him to be a Jewish leader in New Spain. However, Carvajal is not a good source because some of his writings is imagination rather than truth. Even his writings are not authentic because they are filtered with the New Testament, with him unaware. In Mexico, they didn't allow one to choose their own identity. Rather, everything had to be forced. The chronicler, he is trying to figure out if this manuscript is authentic or if it is fake. A man named Diaz pretended to be a Jew, and I had Carvajal tell him where his manuscript was. It was because of Diaz that led to Carvajal's death by auto da fe. I thought that was also very interesting how they had like a spy. Kind of reminds me a lot of how Russia would work. They'd have a spy go in and try and have someone confess. And not just Russia, but other places where it's just so sad over and over and over again. A Jew has to hide their identity. And if they stand up to being a Jew, unfortunately, during those times, they were killed. The manuscript was real because the argument is that no one would write as small as Carvajal did. They're trying to figure out, is this book real? Is this book not real? But nobody's going to write that small. So they are holding the real deal. The author, even though found out it was real, had to wait many months to find out to actually read it. The author then discusses how he knows the Mexican government was lax with records and didn't care. The story of Buenos Aires at Borges magazine in the bathroom. So it mentions the blood purity and only those pure blood Christian Mexicans were worthy of office and good jobs. Jews, yet again, were second-class citizens and were hunted down and brutally killed worse than an animal. He was a prophet, he claims, okay, and had many dreams. It appears in his work that he was crazy, schizophrenic, and had other problems, which unfortunately overshadows his effort in a way. This is why I believe that the manuscript is never shown, because it was obvious to the onlooker the craziness of it all, which is sad to say. He obviously tried, but he wasn't in his right mind. The idea of circumcision is not self-mutilation, because Hashem gave this commandment, but if there was no other reason, obviously, then this would be a problem. And it describes how it was, how the whole, he was trying to do everything the best he can, but sometimes it felt like he was not aware so much of what he was doing. So I'm going to just read the quotes and thematic analysis. The Return of the Carvajal. In 2017, the New York Times announced the long-lost memoir of Louis de Carvajal. The Younger had been rediscovered, considered the first autobiography by a Jew in the Americas. The book had been stolen decades earlier from Mexico's National Archives. Here, Ilan Stevans recounts the extraordinary and interesting story of the reappearance of this precious object and how its discovery opened up new vistas onto the world of secret Jews escaping Spanish Inquisition. Called El Mozo the Younger to distinguish him from an uncle of the same name, who was governor of Nuevo Leon, Louis de Carvajal, learned of his Jewishness after being raised a Catholic. He came to recognize himself as the Messiah for fellow crypto-Jews. And he was burned at the stake on December 8th, 1596, in the biggest auto da fe in all of Latin America. Meaning that there's others, maybe he won't be with only one, sometimes there are other people as well that will be burned together, but there was a big deal at the time. His memoir, an 880-page manuscript written by a crypto-Jew targeted by the Holy Office of the Inquisition for unlawful proselytizing activities, is not only distinct, but of enormous value. So the quote, "That's because nothing really disappears. It is just hidden from sight. Losing things is part of being alive and finding them too. The entire universe is one entity made of an almost infinite number of components throughout life. A person acquires and loses different objects or resources as the universe reorganizes itself, and that was the Return of the Carvajal. Now, the Torah perspective is God who creates the world with many living and non-living beings, but only one man was given free will and thus the ability to serve God by choosing to live for his sake. The central expression of this service, the opportunity and responsibility for using those resources given to him by Hashem, by divine providence. Quote, the volume in question recounts Carvajal's rediscovery of his Jewishness after having been raised a Catholic in Spain, and tells how he came to recognize himself as a Messiah for other crypto Jews, who lived far away from the Iberian Peninsula where the Spanish Inquisition exercised its might. So the author's perspective, part one of one's Jewish identity, especially when rediscovered after extreme concealment, is an inherent impetus to help other Jews in their relationship with God. Torah perspective, the soul is literally a part of God, forming one's essential identity because God is absolutely singular and indivisible. Every soul is essentially identical at its root. Therefore, when one becomes more and more aware of it and is in touch with the soul, he is more sensitive to the needs of others and their souls. The quote, Carvajal acknowledged that no matter how much he would be tortured, his role in his life was to become a martyr. Suffering was a way to justify his mission. The author's perspective, suffering is an inherent part of connecting to God, and the greatest show of devotion to God is through suffering for his sake. But the Torah perspective is a bit different. Though one must be ready to sacrifice for God's sake, even giving one's life for him, the ultimate show of devotion is living an entire lifetime for God. Okay, the quote, Carvajal's life is full of adventure. His experiences included near misses in his escape from the ubiquitous eyes of the church, tropical storms, and road to a new world, a botched circumcision that amounted to painful self-mutilation. So the author's perspective on is that everyone has challenges throughout a lifetime, but someone with strong convictions who is not willing to back down might see those experiences as adventures rather than difficulties. The Torah perspective is everything that happens in the world is directed by divine providence. So whatever situation a person finds himself involved in is not a coincidence, but rather an endeavor to transform the world into a divine dwelling place, an adventure. So the next quote is, his quotations from the Hebrew Bible are choppy, selective, and unquestionably filtered through the prism of the New Testament. Cohen believes that Carvajal uses the Vulgate as his source. He and other Judaizantes in Mexico didn't discriminate between the Apocrypha and the Old Testament. They realized the New Testament was unacceptable to Jews, but were unaware that the Apocrypha enjoyed no canonicity. So the author's perspective is non-Jewish influence on Judaism, Jewish texts, and sources in Jewish communities has had far-reaching effects to the extent that even those Jews that pursue authentic Judaism might be led away from genuine Torah values and ideas. The Torah perspective, in aiming to preserve fidelity to Torah literature, Judaism requires that one learns from either original sources or authentic translations rather than those appropriated into other faiths or cultures. Jews that grow up with little or no access to a proper Jewish education from authentic sources are considered sinless, and because any missteps on their part come from lack of knowledge. The quote, next quote, although our world has felt the effects of progress, not much has changed when it comes to allowing people to express their own dissenting ideas and choose their own identity. The author's perspective, throughout history, social pressure forces one to think a particular way, sometimes pushing erroneous concepts out of the societal perspective, but sometimes forcing incorrect ideals upon people. Torah perspective, God gave man freedom of choice, but also designed a person with an advantage to make good choices that head over the heart, intellect, directing emotions. Certainly, people have the right to dissent and express those dissenting ideas, but dissenting from righteousness is not a virtue, though a choice. The next quote, the very same country that burned him at the stake is now celebrating his triumphant return. It is nothing but ironic. The author's perspective, the powers will be used as a person or situation to their advantage when it's in their interest, but completely subjugate the same person if they have no need for him. The Torah perspective, our sages teach, be careful about the government as they approach a man only when they need him. They see him as good friends in good times, but they don't stay for him in time of his trouble. The next quote, a time the descendants of new Christians would rediscover the old Jew religious identity, thus becoming a crypto Jew. The author's perspective, to escape oppression, Jews throughout the generations have outwardly converted to other faiths, but their essential identity remains only to be discovered later. The Torah perspective, just as nothing can affect or change God, nothing can affect or change one's Jewish identity, whether hidden or revealed, because it is rooted in a literal piece of God as the soul. So the next quote is, there was a new type of anti-Semitism, one that held Jewish blood to be hereditary taint that could not be eradicated by baptism. This was the origin of Spanish racism, the first of its kind in Europe, to be specifically directed against the mala sangre, bad blood of the Jews, and to become fixated on the issue of limpieza de sangre, blood purity. The author's perspective, anti-Semitism, like all forms of discrimination, judges and defines a person based on anything but the content of his character. Instead, superficial or imagined distinctions become the focus of oppression. The Torah perspective, everything is rooted in God, including evil. Therefore, it's no surprise in the form of anti-Semitism sees Jewish identity as unmitigated, even by conversion to Christianity through baptism, because in reality, even a Jew who converts to another faith is still Jewish in God's eyes. Last quote, Lewis heard a voice in his dream telling him to be strong and consulted for the holy job. He called the divine and true revelation, for it showed him in the clearest terms that God has chosen him, like a prophet for a high and a lofty purpose of life, and this is his dream suggested by the call of the biblical prophets. The author's perspective, there's a fine line between genuinely prophecy and mental illness. Both are once visited by the former, one suffering from the latter, are convinced of their experience of the revelation of the truth. Prophecy is bestowed only upon those that are exceedingly righteous, pious, wise, and devoted to God. Furthermore, true prophecy cannot fundamentally contradict Torah, especially Torah law. Therefore, someone not meeting those qualifications is most likely suffering from mental health issues. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.